You know, I was looking over some of my macro shots and it occurred to me that many of these look like they were taken in the dark, or in some kind of studio environment. Now, as I know that they were shot outdoors in daylight, but someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with shots like these might wonder, how come they look like this? Why does the background look so dark? Why does the thing being photographed look so isolated in space? So I'm going to take this opportunity to explain how this works. It's really easy and you'll get the hang of it right away. Now, if you actually want to put all of this to use, you're going to have to know how to remotely trigger your flash, either with a simple sync cord or wirelessly. And I've got a couple of videos on how to do that, so you might want to watch those first. Okay, so here I've set up an indoor demonstration for you where I'm using these bright continuous lights to act as our daylight or otherwise ambient illumination. This is going to be our subject, and we'll set up our camera here. Both of these things are going to remain stationary for this demo. I've got one of the continuous lights illuminating the background and one is illuminating the subject. Again, think of these lights as standing in for actual daylight outdoors. If we take a properly exposed photo of this subject under this light, we're going to get just what we'd expect. And we can even pop in a little extra light with the flash. As long as the flash power isn't set too high, we're not going to have any problems. But if the flash is set higher than this, it's going to be too bright for our current camera settings and we'll get a blown out exposure on our subject. Okay, so we still haven't explained how to get a good exposure on the subject in a dark background under bright ambient light at the same time, but we're about to find out how to do this. Now, back to our starting point. Let's leave the flash out of the equation for now. We know that our current camera settings are going to give us a good exposure for our subject, and since the background has about the same amount of light on it, it's also going to show up in our picture. I've got my camera on manual mode, and right now the settings are ISO 100 with the shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. Now, 1/250th of a second is my camera's flash sync speed, and since this demo is ultimately about what the flash does to these shots, I'm keeping it at this speed for all of these shots. We're going to adjust just one setting, the aperture. We're going to take it from a wide f1.4 down to f8. And this is going to cut down on the amount of light passing through the lens during exposure. And you can see that we get a very dark photo this time, even though the light in the scene is really bright. It's just that with our adjustment to the f-stop and all the other settings remaining the same, the light just isn't bright enough to give us a good exposure now. Now let's take it a step further and adjust our aperture down a couple more stops to f16. The image is almost completely dark. Again, this is because there's not enough light in the scene to compete with the camera settings that we're using. And think about this, if we were actually outdoors, it's not like we could turn up the ambient light on demand. But there is one thing that we can do, and let's use our flash. Our flash can pump out all the light we need for our subject here. It's small, but it's going to give you a very powerful burst of light lasting just a few milliseconds. And that's really all you need from a flash. I've got this flash manually set to 1/4 power. Now, if you're using manual flash, you might have to adjust its power or the distance from the flash to the subject to get a good exposure. We're going to point the flash directly at the subject and direct its light down. So now you can see that the amount of light that we're getting from our little flash is powerful enough to give our subject a proper exposure. But the background remains dark, and that's because we're not pointing the flash directly at the background. And even though our background wall is close by, as long as we don't allow too much of our flash to spill over in that direction, we're going to maintain the dark background. And it's as simple as that. To get the same dark background effect outdoors, you can apply the technique that I just showed you. This works out pretty well, especially if the background of the object you're shooting isn't too bright. And to demonstrate this, I've brought the tulips out to the park, and I'll get some shots of these against a background of hedge plants, starting with an aperture of f5. Okay, we're going to leave the ISO and shutter speed where they are, but we're going to drop the aperture down to f16, and that should result in a much darker shot. So now that we know our ambient light has gone pretty dark with these settings, it's time to bring in some flash to properly illuminate our subject area. Our camera settings stay the same, and our flash is set to 1/8 power. So now our tulips are benefiting from the flash and our background remains pretty dark. This is what we want. Now let's shoot against a much brighter background. The sky, ISO and shutter speed remain the same, but I'm using f5.6 to get this result. Next I switch the f-stop down to f16 again, and it's a lot darker, but if we're trying to really darken the sky, we're not getting that to happen even with our lowest ISO of 100 and our smallest aperture for this lens, which is f16. The only exposure adjustment we can make to further darken the sky at this point is an adjustment to our shutter speed. So I'll try 1/2000th of a second to see if we can get the sky to go dark. And that does actually work. Of course, now we want to use the flash on our subject, but there's a problem with this. We can't use a flash when we're using such a high shutter speed unless we use high-speed sync with that flash. In order to use high-speed sync, we need a flash with high-speed sync capability that's compatible with our camera. I have one of those and I'm attaching it to my camera with a dedicated TTL sync cord. We're going to use the flash in TTL mode. The camera is still in manual mode. And now TTL and high-speed sync are going to work together to give us correct exposures for our flowers using the faster shutter speeds we need to produce this type of shot under these conditions.